The OU will not certify birds as kosher based on the testimony of individuals that those birds are or were eaten in their communities. Rather, the OU will only certify those birds that have been eaten as kosher in the United States for generations. To which Rav Belsky adds, after a lengthy investigation, and there's absolutely not one single shaila that this bird is one of the oifos taharos, then we could be materit. Ubelvad achrei shakla v'taryi and poskim the gufim amekubalim al roiv Yisrael, and also dependent on the fact that we have to investigate that this is a Mesora that is acceptable on most of Klal Yisrael. So to the extent that we will be able today to lessen the inherent tension between preserving individual Mesoras, which are on the way to extinction on the one hand, and preserving the integrity of the kashrus of Klal Yisrael on the other hand, this is today's great challenge, in my own personal opinion. And if we accomplish it, it will be one of today's great successes. May we be zocha to the last sentence of Rabbi Genak's letter, which you could find at the beginning of the source book, which was written as an introduction to this source book, and he wrote it on Erev Shabbos Kodesh Parsha Shmini, and I quote, "May we merit that Hashem bless our efforts to preserve the true Mesora of kosher birds and animals in Klal Yisrael, Erev Shabbos Kodesh, to the last pasuk of Parsha Shmini, L'seder, Lahavdil, Ubein Achaya HaNacheles, Ubein Achaya Asher Loise Ochel Shnas Tovshin Samach Daled," signed Rabbi Menachem Genak. At this time, I would like to call a little change in our program. I'd like to call on Rabbi David Cohn, who is the Safra Dedaina of the Bezdin at the OU, which is comprised of Rabbi Genak and Rabbi Hershel Schachter and Rabbi Yisrael Belsky, and he will be speaking on the how OU policy is established, and he will be focusing specifically on the kashrus of Turkey, which, by the way, is one of the box lunch sandwiches if you've ordered in advance.
Actually, somebody asked me over Shabbos if that's what I ordered for lunch. In fact, I did. Okay, good morning. I'm going to speak for a couple of minutes about how it came to be that turkey is accepted as a kosher bird. Before I begin, I have to thank Rabbi Zivotofsky, who's sitting here, for his encompassing and completely comprehensive article on that topic, on the topic of Turkey, and also to Dr. Zohar Amar, who wrote something in his book in Hebrew, continued on the topic of Turkey. Much of what I'm going to speak is based on on their research, and Rabbi Zivotofsky's article on Turkey is in fact in the handbook. As an introduction to the question, the Torah lists 24 birds that are not kosher by name, without any way of telling us how to identify those 24 birds. Chazal in the Gemara told us that there are 4 simonim for a kosher bird, of which one of them is most important, and that is that the animal should not be a dirus, which is loosely translated as being a predator. And if a bird is a dirus, is a symbol that it's not kosher, and that's the most important of the reasons to prove whether the bird is kosher or not. According to the Gemara, a person could either eat birds, either because they had a Kabbalah, they had a Mesora that this bird is in fact kosher, it's not one of those 24 birds, or they could eat it because they would check the simanim. If they checked the different simanim for the bird, they would know it's a kosher bird. In that regard, if we looked at a turkey has the simanim that the Gemara describes. The 3 simple simanim are in fact there. A side siman of what the shape of its eggs is also there. And as far as it being a dirus, it appears to not be a dirus. But that last point, that it appears to not be a dirus, is in fact the discussion of the Gemara. The Gemara says about a bird called the Tarnagolta, the Agma. And this bird, for years, was assumed to be kosher. It was assumed to not be a dirus. But then, after time, they discovered that in fact it was a dirus. So of course, this shook people up to see that this bird that they had always assumed was kosher was in fact a dirus. And they, as a result, Rashi brings down over there, it's in the Isav Heta later, that we don't eat a bird unless it has a Mesora. In Din, one could eat it just by checking the simonim, check that it doesn't have a simon of being treif. But in practice, we only eat birds with a Mesora because of this concern that we won't be familiar enough to know whether the bird is a dirus. It's not as straightforward whether a bird is a dirus. The Mechaber, to a great extent, accepts this, but leaves room open to accepting certain birds even without a Mesora, if we could be very certain that it's a kosher bird. And the Ramah, so to speak, closes the door and takes this sheet of the Isav Heter completely, and he says, we don't eat any birds unless they have a Mesora. And of course, that brings us to our question. Turkey is a New World bird. It's a bird that was discovered in South America and was brought back to the Old World. So of course, there's no Mesora that a turkey is kosher because no Yid had eaten it until then, and Moshe Rabbeinu, to our knowledge, never saw a turkey. So if we only eat birds based on a Mesora, how in the world do we eat this bird turkey that we know does not have a Mesora? In fact, there were poskim that did say that turkey was treif. There were occasional poskim, one who possibly was talking about turkey, Shlomo Kluger, who said it was treif. Throughout the Dairis, there were individual Rabbanim who didn't eat it. The most famous in recent times of Yaakov Kamnetsky is reported to not eat it. But those people were all Yotzim and Akal. That was by no means the rule. In fact, the tshuvas that talk about turkey all start off as follows. There's this bird that we all eat it, and everybody assumes that this bird is kosher. But it doesn't have a Mesora. So how in the world do we eat this? Then follows a lengthy discussion of reasons why we should or should not accept it, all kinds of reasons, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And the conclusion is, and therefore, we should continue eating this bird. And that's the general outlook of all the tshuvas that talk about it. And that's, in fact, has been the accepted practice. That basically, yes, there were always individuals who did not eat it, but the general consensus was that people ate it. They considered it to be bird, considered it to be kosher. In fact, Dr. Amar brings two passing references. There's a Prima Godim in his Treifus. In describing the Tzumas Hagidin, a certain kind of Treifus, he talks about turkey as if that's just like a regular bird that he has to talk about. This is the Tzumas Hagidin for that bird. And the Noid Yehuda has a shayla about what happens. Some birds will cook together, and they found out later that one was a treifa. So it had a shayla about a taruvis mixed together, and one of the birds in that soup was turkey, but it was like as if that was like an assumed to be kosher bird. So we have a question. Why do we eat this bird? We know that it doesn't have a Mesora. And to strengthen the question is that the tshuvas about turkey as to whether it is or is not kosher are to a great extent from the late 1800s and the 20th century, and followed a serious discussion about other birds that had come up in those days. But in fact, these birds had been eaten for hundreds of years before that in Europe. So we have a second question. Where were all the shilas until then? How come there was no shilah until, I don't know, the middle of the 19th century? Do we first start seeing questions about whether turkey is kosher? Why were people eating it until then? Hopefully, we'll get to answer these questions, or at least present what Poskim had mentioned about. And the answers to this question will be in three different groups. The first group is, some Poskim said, the answer is, because you really don't need a Mesora. Some said, the minig to eat turkey, which started in the late 1500s, maybe early 1600s in Europe, was before the Ramah. The Ramah brought this minig, but they were already eating it beforehand, which of course is hard to accept because the Ramah didn't make up the minig. The Ramah didn't make up the minig and people started accepting it. The Ramah was reporting an Isav Heter, which is based on a Rashi that people have been doing for Dairis. And others said from a different angle that the fact that we eat turkey is a raya that we don't pass like the Ramah, which the Achronim, of course, strongly disagree with. We always pass like the Ramah. Everybody knows in this din we also continue to pass like the Ramah. So this suggestion that we shouldn't need a Mesora, that turkey is a raya that you don't need a Mesora, is hard to accept. A different approach was that there's an indirect Mesora on turkey. And it goes as follows. The Gemara explains that if a person had a Rebbe who was a hunter, who's familiar with birds, and knew all 24 treif birds, then if they catch some kind of bird in the street and they know it's not one of those 24 birds, they could eat it because they know the 24 treif ones, everything else is kosher, so they could eat it. Of course, giving the impression that there were in fact people who were able to do that. Well, none of them saw a turkey, so they must have known the 24 treif birds, and they obviously never saw a turkey, so this was not one of those treif birds. And later in the day, I understand there's going to be a lineup here of different birds. So in the base medrash in Pumbedita, so they had all 24 birds, and turkey wasn't there, so it must have been not a treif bird. The question is, the Gemara also says that when a bird, an ozniya, or perez is treif, a treif of bird doesn't mean just one specific bird. There are many species or subspecies of a bird that are included in that. So understanding what makes a bird, how to identify a treif bird includes being able to compare other birds to it and to know what's the same and what's not the same. So I don't know the 24 birds, but maybe if someone who knew the 24 birds and who also knew the science of comparing birds and understanding what's one species, when a turkey would have walked past him, he would have known, oh, there's the daya, that's the one, that's just like a daya, it's another variation of that. So the fact that they never saw it doesn't mean that if they would have seen it, they wouldn't have known which of the treif birds it's like. A riot to this question that I'm mentioning is, Rabbi Zivotofsky points out, there's 3 birds that he mentions, a peregrine falcon, a bald eagle, and an osprey, which are also New World birds, and those birds are very treif. The Gemara gives simanim to know a bird is treif, and those birds are definitely treif. So you can't say that there were no treif birds that are only New World birds, because we know there are treif ones. So the answer back to that is that no, those birds are similar enough to their old world cousins that someone in the times of Chazal would have seen it, would have known that this is in the species of those treif birds. But turkey is like a quintessential example of a New World bird. It's an example of a bird that's so radically different from everything else that there's nothing it could have been possibly compared to. So the poskim who saw it for hundreds of years knew that it was kosher because it can't be that this is a treif bird. This couldn't have been one of those 24. The weakness with this is that we're making, whoever, to suggest this is making an assumption that you know all of the birds in the world. You're so familiar with the birds that you can say this turkey is radically different than anything else. Now, I'm obviously not that, and I don't know anybody else who's able to do that, but it's making an assumption that not only is it true, but that the poskim through all generations until the late 1800s also knew that. They're able to look at this bird and say it's so obviously different that it can't be kosher, that it can't be one of the treif birds. I'm not so familiar with all the birds, but just Friday, somebody mentioned to me, he said he had a reason, he thinks that turkey is kosher because it's very similar to a bird called a great bustard. Okay, now, I looked at the great bustard. I don't see the great dimion to the great bustard, but okay. But I'm saying I never heard of a great bustard, and this person didn't. He thinks it looks like a turkey. So, I mean, who knows how many thousands of other birds, maybe Rabbi Slifkin can tell us all the thousands of birds that are out there, and which is it really so strange? So this whole approach is taking an assumption that it's so obviously different that it can't be that it's kosher. Can't be that it's treif. Okay. And the third, and maybe the most interesting, is the group of poskim who try to say, in fact, there is a Mesora in a turkey, which of course is hard to understand, but that's what they want to say. The first group says, they saw this bird, they said, nah, it's just a big chicken. It's the same thing, it's just a chicken. Or like what I just mentioned, it's this bustard, or some other bird. And as they looked at the turkey, and they knew it was kosher because they could see that it was just like another bird that they knew was kosher. If you, in the source book, in the tshuva that Rabbi Grossman mentioned beforehand, it shows how Dr. Tshuva has many shilas brought up about comparing birds, deciding what's like something, what's not like something, and that idea to say that a bird is kosher because it's like something else is very difficult to apply, and as Rabbi Zivotofsky says, it's very open to abuse. You know, you can compare anything. I mean, if you read enough of the Darkei Teshuvas, you could literally make anything kosher. There's so many choices of what makes something the same. Then there are those who have suggested that turkey breeds with other kosher birds. Since it breeds with kosher birds, it's a raya that it's kosher. It's based on a Gemara in Bechoros talking about animals. That animals, treif and kosher animals don't breed together. The weaknesses with this argument are that, first of all, there's a machlokes in the poskim whether that Gemara applies to birds at all. Even if it does apply to birds, many studies have tried to breed turkey and chicken and turkey with other birds unsuccessfully, by and large unsuccessfully. And even where it was successful, it was, as a rule, it was through artificial insemination, and it's not clear that the Gemara's rule applies even to such cases. Additionally, there's an interesting netziv, that says that the fact that we've eaten it for so many dairies gives us a pseudo Mesora on it, and now the people who want to make a treif, they're on the defense. They have to prove that the bird is treif. We've created a Mesora, so to speak, whatever that means. And then an original, this one, most original svara, which is when the explorers came to the United States and they found this turkey, they came, to South America and even maybe to North America, and they found this turkey, there were people living in the United States, people living in America. Those people were remnants of the Aseres HaShvatim, who had a Mesora back from Moshe Rabbeinu that it was kosher, so they got it from them. By far the most original svara. And then, lastly, what is true is turkey was brought back from the New World to the Old World, and from there it spread throughout Europe. One of the ways that it spread was through the Ottoman Empire, which is based in Turkey, and in fact that's why we call this bird turkey, because people for a long time believed that it was a Turkish bird. That's where it came from. Other people thought that it came from India, and like in Hebrew we call it the Tarnagal Hoidu, we call it an Indian bird. Other people call it that. The Kafachayim says that's what it's called. And people got a Mesora from those communities that gave them the bird. That is to say, someone in Poland got these birds from people in Turkey, or got it from people in India, and he turned to these people and he said, to other Yidden, he says, is this a kosher bird? And they said, yeah, by us we eat it. So the Mesora came from the people in Turkey and India. Okay, well, where did the people in Turkey and India get their Mesora from? And with that in fact, we expect Rabbi Schechter will discuss this topic, which is as follows. As I mentioned, the Mechaber says that in certain cases we can eat a bird without a Mesora. It's the Ramah who says that we only eat a bird if it has a Mesora. The Mechaber leaves the door open to certain cases eating a bird without a Mesora. Turkey and India, which to my understanding are by and large Sephardic communities, held like the Mechaber, and they may have accepted the bird without what we would consider a Mesora. They had other ways to decide the bird was kosher. They took that bird. Yidden in Ashkenazic communities got the bird from them, and these people told them, yeah, the bird has a Mesora. So maybe the most plausible is that in fact they got it from these people. Those people told them it was kosher, and they continued eating it. They had a Mesora from those other Yidden. So that's a topic that Rabbi Schechter will be addressing as to, is it proper, or when is it proper to take a Mesora from a different community? And if in fact this is true, then we sitting here, well, the Ashkenazim sitting here, who know their Mesora comes in effect from a Sephardic source, in a source that started off with we know, not a Mesora, so we would have to question then whether that Mesora would be acceptable for us. To summarize, we had a question as to how could it be we only eat birds that have a Mesora. This bird clearly does not have a Mesora. Some argued that it doesn't need a Mesora. Birds don't need a Mesora altogether. They argued on the Ramah. Some said there's an indirect Mesora because it couldn't have been one of the treif birds. And lastly, there were different ideas as to how we could possibly have a Mesora for this bird. Each of these reasons have different questions, factual or halachic questions on them. And the only nechama we have is, the Gemara says that afilu behemten shel tzadikim, even the animals of tzadikim, the Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't let them eat treif. And through these hundreds of years, many tzadikim themselves have eaten turkey, so we could take nechama that the Rebbeinu Shalom wouldn't have let them be nichshel in it. Thank you. Have a good day.
Thank you, Reb David, for your very informative talk on the Kashrus of Turkey. I omitted to offer a Koros HaTov to Reb David Cohn for organizing the very comprehensive source book that everyone has been handed. He put a lot of work into it, and we appreciate very much his efforts in that regard. And speaking about a Koros HaTov, we owe a tremendous debt of gratitude to the Lander College, to Mr. Kobry from Turo and Lander College, Rebbitzin Daniel Lander, Dr. Sokol, the entire custodial crew who have really opened up their doors and their hearts to host this conference. And of course, Yosef Baroish is the next speaker who will offer greetings, and he is a person who has become literally a legend in his own lifetime, which teaches each of us what one dedicated and creative individual can do. I speak of none other than the president and founder of Turo College, Rabbi Dr. Bernard Lander. Please offer us words of greeting. Thank you.
It is my privilege to greet all of you to our institution. This program is being conducted in honor of the memory of Mrs. Kushner, the mother of Charlie Kushner, a veteran member of our Board of Trustees. Mrs. Kushner has been noted for her support of Torah studies. She's provided the funds for different yeshivas, especially the famous high school in Elizabeth that was founded by Rabbi Teitz. I welcome all of you. This subject is fascinating. The problems are real. I have also been struggling with the question of what is the Mesora for the turkey that we eat, and I'm looking forward again to hear from Rabbi Herschel Schechter his interpretation. I hope this is a day that will be important to you in terms of Torah study and halachic information.
Our next speaker is an individual who I think has very often shown tremendous courage, and I think this entire conference, it was a very courageous effort on his behalf and his involvement in the whole conference and in the whole OU. And of course, I speak of the rabbinic administrator of the OU Kashrus, whose name is on every letter of certification that you see around the world, the large global network of the OU, and that is none other than Rabbi Menachem Gnachshlit.
I also want to welcome everybody to this conference. I want to thank, we just heard from Rabbi Dr. Bernard Lander, who is as was said, a legend in his time and in terms of the field of education, Jewish education. What he's done is heroic and is representative of a man, though his eyesight may be fading, but his vision is extraordinary, a man of genius, and I'm happy that I'm able to follow him. I also want to acknowledge some of the people who are here in the audience today. His son, Rav Daniel Lander, who is my closest friend, Rav Chavusa, become a renowned Talmid Chacham, Rosh Yeshiva Chaim, Rav Herschel Schechter, one of the poskim for the OU, the head of the Kollel Yeshiva University, Rabbi Weinrib, the executive vice president of the OU, Rabbi Zweigenhaft, a master shoichet who we'll be hearing from a little bit later. And I want to thank all those who were involved, especially Rabbi Grossman, who coordinated everything in putting this program together. And I also want to thank Rabbi Dr. Chaim Wasserman, who is the chairman of the Kashrus Commission. I probably left somebody out, but you'll forgive me. I'm going to speak about, when we began this conference, we thought that this issue about Mesora, birds, it was a very esoteric issue, sort of like Hilchos L'Mashiach. And as we were planning the conference, two issues came up. I'm going to speak about the second, but became very much halach l'maisa and was played up to a large extent in the press, both here in the United States and in Israel. One issue was about the leghorn, which is a chicken which some people claimed was the
was not a kosher chicken, and the reason is one of the simonim for a kosher chicken, the Mishnah says, is that when the bird perches, it separates its four fingers or four claws, two in front, two in the back, and that's a simon of a non-kosher bird. And there was a claim that this leghorn, which is a species of bird which is commonly used for eggs, is a non-kosher, and all our eggs are not kosher because we have aloha yotzim not tame tame. If the bird is not tame, so that which comes of it, the egg, or in the case of a mammal, the milk, is not kosher. So that issue came up. In fact, it was resolved. All poskim agreed. There are different batidinim and research. In fact, the information is inaccurate. Indeed, when it perches in a very precarious position, it will split its talons or fingers, but toes. But generally, it does not. And it's the badats and other Bazdins declared it to be a kosher bird. The other issue that came up, and that's the one I'm going to speak about today, is about the zebu. The zebu is a kind of cattle that is indigenous to India and is commonly slaughtered now in South America. It's a strange-looking cattle. It has a very fleshy hump and skin under its neck. Its ears droop. It's very unique in terms of its experience. And the issue is the zebu kosher? Why not? After all, we know in terms of what determines a kosher species, I'm going to speak about what the determinant is, but in terms of animals, a kosher animal is one which is mafreshes pashas or sharses and malagera, split hooves and chews its cud, which indeed the zebu does. And in terms of fish, that it has a snappefash kashkeshes, scales and fins. So what's the issue about the zebu, since it seems to meet the criterion? Well, the historical background is this. The Shach says that, this is the way the Chochmas Adam interprets the Shach, that just like the halach is that by birds, in order to eat a bird, we following the Ramah, interpreting the Gemara in Chul, and the Gemara says, since we don't know exactly what the 24, people might not know exactly what the 24 birds that are non-kosher that I mentioned in the Torah are, birds are only nechel b'mesoris. And the Ramah interprets that to mean that without a Mesora, you're not allowed to eat a bird. So offhand, that halacha only applies to birds, because birds, the Torah doesn't tell us, as it does by fish and animals, a certain criterion what determines it to make it kosher and not kosher. Birds are simply anything which is not one of these 24 is kosher. So there you need a Mesoris. However, the Chochmas Adam says, no, that the halacha doesn't only apply to birds. Animals also, even though they're mafres passions, so sarses and malagera and so on, they also have to have a Mesora to be eaten. And the Chazon Ish held that this is the correct reading of the Shach, the Chochmas Adam's reading, and the issue came up in the early 50s, at the time of the establishment of the State of Israel. The then Chief Rabbi, Rav Herzog, Zechron Levacha, posed this question, whether the zebu, which was at the time being slaughtered in Madagascar, which was one of the basic sources for kosher meat for Israel, can we import the zebu to Israel? And the Chazon Ish, quoting this Chochmas Adam, said that you cannot. Now, the Chochmas Adam is a shtickle achidush, because offhand, as I said, by birds, we can understand the Gemara says that you require Mesora. But here, the criterion is determined. Why should you acquire a Mesora? And the Pri Megadim says that that's not the correct reading of the Shach. What the Shach meant was only to distinguish between a Chaya and a Behema, because there are different halachas. A Chaya requires Kisi Adam, a Behema doesn't. A Chaya, the Chaylev is mutter, and by a Behema, the Chaylev is also. So to determine which is a Chaya, which is a Behema, which the Gemara has long discussions about, depending on the kind of horns it has, those things are not so easily determined. For that you need a Mesora, but otherwise you don't need a Mesora. That's what the Pri Megadim held. And Rov Poskim, Kaf HaChaim, and others held like this Pri Megadim. This issue re-emerged now, but because of the Chazon Ish's opposition, because it was the Chazon Ish, so the at least the official policy of the State of Israel was not to import the zebu, the meat of the zebu. Now, this is the official policy. I remember after the Six Day War, I remember reading a Newsweek article. They interviewed a sergeant from the Israeli army, they had just captured a convoy of Jordanian meat. So the Newsweek reporter asked the the Israeli sergeant, what are you going to do with this meat? The official army, the official policy of Israel is that the army only eats kosher. He said, well, we do a lot of unofficial eating also. So this is the issue that came up right now, because they discovered 50 years later that, in fact, in South America, a lot of the animals that they're shechting are zebus, and some of them, if they're not zebus themselves, but they're a crossbreed of the zebu with the Angus, which, so, I mean, if you follow the tradition of the mother, you know, if you're the father of Kosher Zerav, so the kashrus of this crossbreed comes into question. And the one who's dealing with this issue right now was Rav Elyashiv, and his initial psak was, if you have it in your freezer, you don't have to throw out the meat, maybe because there was a rove and so on, but he said they should stop the policy, and they should only now, at least prospectively, only use non-zebu. But as Rabbi David Cohen pointed out in a recent conference, it's not so trivial to change, because unbeknownst to the population of Israel, the zebu has, its wonderful quality is it's a very hardy animal. That's why it survives in very harsh climates where it's very hot, not enough water. The downside is its meat, because it's so hardy, is not as tender, it's not as delectable. But it's hardy. Now, Israel, years ago, imported milking cows from Holland, but they found that they didn't do well in the climate in Israel, which was, you know, hotter than the Dutch climate. So what they did at the end was they crossbred the milking cows with zebus. So all the milk, the mahadran milk and so on, that is a big portion of it going into the cheese and so on, is a derivative of the zebu. So the problem presents itself not only in that context, as it was also reported, there's also a possibility that many of the klaf, or the oiris that are used for tefillin mezuzahs, also may be derivative of the zebu. Mesora, most folks, as Rav Herzog pointed out, thought that the zebu was kosher. And I want to speak about whether this halach of Mesora should apply also to behemoths as well, or should be limited only to ophos, as the Pri Megadim understands. And I thought that this shaila may depend on how we understand the halach of Mesora. What is the requirement of the Mamoha, based on the Gemara, that an oif is only nechel b'Mesoros? There are two ways. Of course, the reason Mesoros was established is because it's difficult to determine which of the 24 birds, what's the names of them. They're not 100% clear. So therefore, we insist on a Mesora for those birds. But afterwards, in that halach of Mesora, why is there that there's a requirement of Mesora? Is the pshat simply it's a suffix? So since it's a suffix, we insist on having a Mesora to memvara this up. But the Mesora is not the maktir. The maktir is, let's say, is that it's of toho, but it's not midrabon. Of course, the requirement to Mesora is superimposed is certainly only drabonon. But that drabonon, is it because it's just additional bira and therefore we need the Mesoros? Or no, the halacha is midrabonon, since the siman is not so clear, what is of toho and which is not an of toho, and the Mishnah has different simonim to determine which the 24 are. It has 4 simonim, that it's not a doiris, it's not predatory, that has an etz b'yasera, with machlokes Shoshani what it means, but let's say that it means that it has the 4th toe is in the back, has an extra toe, that it's the kukavin is niklaf, and that it has a zefek. So these things tell us a simonim, but they're not goyim, the kashrus. If it's 24, if it's not one of the 24, it's mutter. So, but on the drabon level, the matir is also that you need a Mesoros on it. Oh no, it's just a birur. So if the halacha is that it's a birur, so that should only apply to oifis, because by behemoths we know what the birur is. We'll see if it has these criteria, if it's maligera and if it's mafreses pausa. But if the halacha is that that the Mesoros, because of this, the Mesoros is part of the matir, so then maybe they equated oifis, what the Gemara says by oifis was also equated to behemoths. And I wanted to show you this halach of Mesoros that the Gemara speaks about. There is a chalashem midiraisa of Mesora by behemoths, because Rashi quotes based on the Torah's Kohanim, and it's really similar in the Gemara Menachos with slightly different language. Rashi quotes in the pasuk the end of Shemini v'zos hachaya, The Rashi says that the Rebbeinu Shalom sold Moshe Rabbeinu all the behemoths to Horitz, and those that are kosher, and those are not kosher. And presumably, if showed him the oifus also, could be that the Rebbeinu Shalom showed Moshe Rabbeinu a turkey. It was imported and sent out. But so Rashi says that Moshe Rabbeinu showed every Klal Yisrael, this is kosher, this is not. So you see that there was a locha of Mesora that was chal. And Rav Shechter has in his Pninei Harav, he quotes from Rav Gerelik, an interesting hayora. The Rambam Shita is that there's a kind of a insect that if you eat, that you like it for Sheretz HaOf and Sheretz HaMayim and Sheretz HaOretz, what the Gemara calls Putisa, it has all these remarkable qualities. And the Ravid says, such a thing doesn't exist. What is the Ram talking about? So we never found such a versatile insect. So Rav Gerelik quoted in the name of the Brisker Rav, that the Brisker Rav said like this: in the Metzias, the Ravid is right. You never found such an insect that does everything. It flies, it swims, it dances, it's everything, right? So, but the Ravid is not machlokes Metzias, but the Ravid says that since Moshe Rabbeinu showed everybody which behemoth, which insect, and so on, which is mutter. So it doesn't depend on in terms of biologically how we determine it. If it looks like this, since that was what the Mesora was, so it's chal that has the din of sheretz ha'of and so on. I only quote this to show you that there really was a chalashem Mesora on what the oifas are. So, and we know because called the tikkun rabbanan came to Yeraisa tikkun, when chachama make a takana or a requirement, it always falls. They don't just invent it out of, at least the context of the formulation of it is called the tikkun rabbanan came to Yeraisa tikkun, falls on the rubric of a Yeraisa concept. So you see that there is a chayil Hashem Mesora as relates to the meaning to Horim and Tameim, and so maybe that's the Mesora that's matir. And the Chazon Ish held, based on this Chochmas Adam, that it applies to behemoths as well. This issue, I thought, may depend also on another issue, which is discussed in Achronim. We know that by oifis there's no simonim to tell us which is an oath Torah. It's the 24 species that are not kosher, those are tmeim. Beyond that, everything is kosher. But by behemoths and by dagim, the Torah has criteria. So the question is this. I'm going to start with dagim, and then we'll talk about by behemoths. What's the locha that a dag, in order to be kosher, has to have a snappy v'kashkeshes? Is the pshat, this kind of fish is kosher, carp is kosher, salmon is kosher, tuna is kosher. How do we know? The Torah gives us to tell us that these are the simonim, it's a mavara that this is kosher. Oh no, it's not just that it's mavara that's kosher. The thing that's going in the kashrus is what? Is the snap of the kashkeshas. So a raya to that, Achronim point this out as well. Levari has it, but I always thought the pshat the Gemara is this. The Gemara says that everything that has a kashkeshes has a snapir. Everything that has scales has fins, but not everything that has fins has scales. So then it would seem that the snapir is completely irrelevant. The Torah doesn't have to tell us about the snapir, because just check if it has a kashkeshes. Because knowing that it has a snapir by itself will not be sufficient. So the Gemara answers Yagdal Tov Yadir. What does it mean Yagdal Tov? If it's a biro, so the snap is irrelevant. It's not going to give us the information we need, and the kashkeshes gives us the full information in terms of scale. But if we say that the snap of a kashkeshes is goyim the kashes, it's what makes it a kosher min in terms of dagim. So indeed for the biro it's irrelevant, but al pidin, that's what means Yagdal Tov. The thing that indeed is goyim the kashrus is also the snapir. Now the issue is, what about by behemoths? So the Ragat Shova has about this in Parsha Shmini in the Tzofnas Paneach and Chumis, and others talk about it. I think there's Navnei Nezer that talks about it. Someone suggests that by behemoths, the simonim, that is Malagera and Mafres Pasha, that's not the going with the kashers. It's this min is kosher, right? That's just a raya. For her raya, the raya is, the halacha is that if a behemoth tahira gives birth to it gives birth to an animal that doesn't have split hooves, it gives it to a kolot. So the halacha is that it's kosher. If this is that's going the kashrus, so we're the simonim that are to be growing the kasher. If it's a beer that this belongs to the kosher species, so its mother's kosher, so it's also kosher. But if you need to create the kashrus, the snap of the malagera and mafis parsa, this is not mafis parsa, it's a kolot. Why is it kosher? So many achronim want to say, you see from there that by behemoths it's just a liar, but not that this is the goyim, the cause of the kashrus. I heard the other day Rav Shechter Shlita said that no, could be that no, it's also that the simonim are goyim, but the simonim of the mother help for the vlad. That's the pshat. This animal is called a mafreses parsa. Why? Because the mother is, and just like by shchita, the shchita the mother helps for the vlad. So the simonim of the mother help for the vlad, and that's calling the kasher. Why do I mention this? Because this also may be relevant. Because if the din is that really the simonim are goyim the kashrus, are a liar what it is, you could say either way. But I was thinking like this: that if it's just a liar, so the Torah tells you what the liar is. Right? But if it's that it's the goyim the kashrus, so then you need maybe the lebiru. There's another matir that, namely, on the drabanan level, of course, of Mesora. The issue of the zibu remains unresolved. It will live beyond this conference, so we'll have to wait till Rav Elyashiv decides. But the concepts that we're dealing with in terms of maintaining the Mesora, I just want to close with this notion that Rav Soloveitchik, the Rav Zichron Levracha, has in his Yotzei Shum, he would often quote from Rav Chaim that there are two kinds of Mesora. There's the Mesora in Halacha, and there's the Mesora the Maisa. And that's why the Rav said that Rav Chaim was opposed to the reintroduction of Tcheles, because he thought that this Mesora, what Tcheles is, you can't just say a shtickle Torah to determine what it is. You have to have ish mi pi'is, the Mesora. And I'd say the model to that is the Mesora that Moshe Rabbeinu introduced, v'zos achayev, what are the behemoths ksheris and not ksheris. But we today are dealing, what this conference means to establish is in fact the Mesora Lamaisa of the different oifers, and continue this tradition of Mesora on the Maisa as well as the Halacha. Thank you.
Shkoyach Rabbi Genak, as we mentioned before, the Bezdin at the OU is comprised of Rabbi Genak, Rabbi Yisrael Belsky, and also our next speaker, who the OU is nanna from tremendously, and also I'd like to give a course atov that Rav Shechter is always available for the needs of the OU, even under very trying conditions. And it's a great covet for me to introduce Harav Hagoin Rav Hershel Shechter. Shlita.
Yesterday, at the end of the Kriyas HaTorah, at the end of Parshas Kedoshim, we read the pasuk v'hivdaltem bein habehem hator latmeo bein ha'of hatomi latohor, etc. So the Rambam in the Sefer HaMitzvahs counts as 4 mitzvahs aseh the following, and the whole Mishnah Torah is based on the Sefer HaMitzvahs. The beginning of every section in the Mishnah Torah, the Rambam lists off how many mitzvahs he's going to explain here. So in the beginning of Hilchas Macholas Asuras, the Rambam lists off how many mitzvahs he has here. And the first 4 are the following. Number 1, livdak b'simani behem b'bechaya, in order to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher. Number 2, livdak b'simani ha'of, in order to determine which birds are kosher and not kosher. Number 3, livdak b'simani ha'chagovim, etc. Number 4, livdak b'simani ha'dogim. These are 4 mitzvahs aseh. Exactly what does that mean? Livdak b'simani. So when you look in the opening line in the Rambam in Hilchas Macholas Asuras, he writes, mitzvahs aseh leida hasimonim shemavdilim bein atomi latohar. The Rambam doesn't say that when you shecht an animal, you have to be bodig b'simonim. He doesn't say when you catch a fish, you have to be bodig b'simon. He says it's a mitzvah aseh to know what the simonim are. One could understand the Rambam in the following way. We know that the Balatanya wrote the Shulchan Aruch, and most of the Shulchan Aruch Harav is just like a Chayodim. It's a kitzer of the big Shulchan Aruch. It has a liquid from the Taz, from the Shach, from the Magen Avram, whatever. Except for Hilchas Talmud Torah. Hilchas Talmud Torah he rewrote from the beginning. He rewrote the whole thing. So he has Moira Dike Zachen there. So he writes, among other things, one of the main points that the Balatanya brings out is that there is a mitzvah sesei to learn Kol HaTorah Kula. Then he quotes the Psukim from the Chumash and the Sifra and the Sifrei, all the Tanoim say like that. And then he asked Akasha, how is that possible? It's physically impossible. The Torah is Arukam Eretz Midah Rechavim Miniyam. So he says, no, that Pasuk, that Gemara in Erevin refers to the Oimek Piniminiyas Havanas HaTorah. But as far as what is the text of the Torah that you have an obligation to learn Kol HaTorah Kula, that's not Arukam Eretz Midah. You have a bookcase, and the bookcase contains so many Svarim, and that's considered Kol HaTorah Kula that you have an obligation to learn. Tavos Heis Kol HaTorah Kula. So the Baal HaTanya says it's not such a big library. It's just the 24 Svarim of the Tanakh, the Mishnayos, Talmud Bavli, Yerushalmi, Sifros, Sifrei Mechilte, Rambam, and Shulchan Aruch. No, Agrad is not so much. Agrad is not so much. A person who's in English literature probably has to read more books than that. But that's all, that's the text. That's what you have to learn Kol HaTorah Kula. And the rest is the Havanas HaTorah. Then you have libraries and libraries and libraries. That's Arukam Eretz Midah Rochav Miniyam. So now the question is, and that's all? That's the whole text that you have to learn is just Tanakh, Mishnayos, Sifros, Sifrei Mechilte, Talmud Bavli, that's all. So they quote in the name of the Vilna Gaon that there's a little bit more in addition to that. So they quote from the Gra that to know the geography of Eretz Yisrael is a chelik of Talmud HaTorah. I don't know the geography of Eretz. I don't know what's north, I don't know anything. So they quote from the Vilna Gaon like that based on his Zohar. That Moshe Rabbeinu was the Ish HaTorah, and the Rebbeinu Shalom showed him, he was chalashing to see Eretz Yisrael. Rebbeinu Shalom showed him, and he showed him all the borders. So that's also considered a chelik of Talmud Torah. So the Rambam here in the beginning of Hilchas Macholas Asura seems to be saying that to know enough biology in order to be able to say over what determines whether this is a kosher bird, or this is a kosher fish, or this is a kosher animal, or this is a kosher chogov, a grasshopper, whatever, this too is a chelik of Talmud Torah. It's not just a hechetim tzebalma. If you won't know the biology, so you won't be able to paskin the shaila. No. Knowing a Talmud Chacham who wants to, a person who wants to fulfill the mitzvah of limud Kol HaTorah Kula, who has to learn Sifros, Sifrei Mechilte, Rambam, Shulchan Aruch, and everything, has to know this also. Has to know enough biology in order to know this as well. But true, they quote, Rabbi Shlosh Shklover quotes in the name of the Vilna Gaon that the extent that a person will be lacking in Shara Chachmas, he will be lacking Mea Yodos Chachmas HaTorah, but he doesn't say that that itself constitutes a mitzvah of Talmud Torah. When you're studying biology, you're studying physics, or you're studying chemistry, or medicine, whatever, that itself is not Talmud Torah. That's a hechsher mitzvah, that's a hachana. To the extent that you'll know the other chachmas, you'll be matzliach more in learning. That's what Rabbi Shlosh Shklover quotes in the name of the Vilna Gaon. But over here, it would appear from the Rambam that this itself, to know the biology, to know enough biology to be able to say over the simonim of behema and dogim and oifes and chagogim, this itself is a chelik of the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. In the Sefer HaChinuch, these four mitzvahs are presented a little differently. Sefer HaChinuch says that when a person is about to eat the fish, he has to be bodik b'simon. A person is about to eat the flesh, he's about to shech, he should be bodik b'simonim of the animal. What does it mean? It means, of course, you have to be bodik. You may be eating non-kosher food. So the Minchas Chinuch elaborates on what the Chinuch said. What it means is that even if the roiv is, the likelihood is that it's probably kosher. And let's say the person eats the food and then later on he checks it and he sees that it had simoni tar and it's a gloy Muslim afraid that it was kosher, but if he ate it before being boidek, so he was over, he was mavatalis mitzvah saseh. So mitzvah says it to be boidek b'simon. Of course, in the Darkei Tshuva points out, what do you mean? Every time we're boidek b'simonim of the fish, and every time we're boidek b'simonim when the sheikh checked chickens, he's boidek b'simonim. He doesn't look at the zefik and the kurkuma, he doesn't look at anything. The answer is, if you don't know what the min is, if it's a min she'eni yodua, then the Darkei Tshuva says, then there's a mitzvah to be bodik b'simon. If I know that this is this type of a fish, and this is a cow, every time I shech the cow, I have to check to see if it's malagem or if it's parsa. No. Shechet sees it's a cow, he shechs it, next he shechs it, he sees it's a cow, it doesn't have to be bodik b'simon. If you don't know what the min is, then you have to be bodik. That's what the Darkei Tshuva points out. What is this all about? So we know that the Ramban has a klal that's quoted in Yeridea that whenever there's a miyut hamotzu, you have to be choshish for the miyut, you have to be bodek. You don't rely on the right whenever there's a miyut hamotzu. What does it mean in a miyut hamotzu? So it's also a question. The Mishkanas Yankov says a 10% chance of violating an Isser, and Rabbi Yashiv has a more stringent opinion. His view is at 7.5%. They both are learning based on the same Gemara in Baba Basra. So Rabbi Yashiv thought that the pshat in the Gemara was that it's 7.5%, not 10%. So there, the Ramban says that's a din midrabanan. You have an obligation to be boidek, not to rely on the roiv. If it's a miyot hamatzui, that's a chumer midrabanan. That's what the Ramban writes before. That's not a din min haTorah. And here, the Sefer HaChinuch understands this mitzvah b'dikis simanim. Number one, it's a din min haTorah. It's not a din midrabanan. And number two, not only do you have to be boidek the simanim when you have a miyut hamatzui, even if you're dealing with a miyut she'ena matzui, you still have a mitzvah sesem in haTorah. Unless the min of the behema, the oaf, is yodua. If it's not yodua, that's what the pasuk say. Even if it's a miyut she'ena matzui, there's still a mitzvah to be bodik b'simanim. Unless Rav Tzvi Pesach Frank has a long tshuva where he elaborates. Unless it's such a far-fetched miyut, it's a echad minei aleph. If such a good roib that it would be good, you wouldn't even consider it a suffix when it comes to suffix hakanas nefashis. You would ignore it. Echad minei aleph alpei alofim. So then it's such a big roib, overwhelming roib. So then there's no mitzvah to be bodik b'simanim by the yoifas either. But otherwise, that's how the Sefer HaChinuch understood. Now, according to the Sefer HaChinuch, this mitzvah to be bodik b'simanim only applies if you're interested in eating the behema or the oif. If you're not interested in eating it, the whole mitzvah doesn't apply. Soloveitchik used to point out the Rambam has another mitzvah in the minyan mitzvahs, kol tzipah tahara tochelu. So what does that mean? Is a mitzvah to eat kosher chicken? And whenever there's a mitzvah, it's not clear how often you have to do the mitzvah, so it's assumed once a day, every day. The Gemara says the Kohanim have to duchen once a day, every day when called upon. Not mechuyev to duchen at second time a day. The Rambam says tefillah b'chol yom is an obligation. Men atar, once a day, every day. Why? Because the pasuk says you have to daven. The b'chol avavchem, avodah shebelev is tefillah. And it doesn't say how often, so it's understood that it's once a day, every day. So there's a mitzvah once a day, every day to have some chicken. How can it be? In 9 days? Everyone's mavatal a mitzvah, no one has any chicken. The answer is no. Kol tzipah torah tachel is an iser aseh. Doesn't mean it's a kiyum aseh. There's no chiyuv to eat chicken. There's no kiyum either if you eat chicken. There's no kiyum. It means an iser aseh if a person eats an oif tummy, so he's over on the aseh. But it's not a kiyum mitzvah. So according to the Sefer HaChinuch, these mitzvahs livdik b'simanim only apply if someone is interested. You can't say there's a mitzvah to go eat an exotic bird, to be bodik b'simanim, to eat the exotic bird in order to preserve the masor. What do you mean? According to the Sefer HaChinuch, the mitzvah is if one is interested in eating a specific bird, he has to be bodik b'simanim. According to the Rambam doesn't say the same as the Sefer HaChinuch. The Rambam seems to say that it's a cheluk of Talmud Torah. So according to the Rambam, it would be a mitzvah to preserve, to write on the books again. You don't have to eat it. You don't have to shecht it. There's no mitzvah to shecht it. It's like the whole Torah Shabbal Peh. The Gemara says in Tamur, the Chachamim saw the Torah Shabbal Peh was going to be forgotten. So because it's Lassel Hashem and Feret Terasecha, so Hitiru, they allowed us to write down the Torah Shabbal Peh. Originally, the din was a dvarm Shabbal Peh. Was Yatar Hashal Yamim B'Ksav. It wasn't permissible. Pashut Pshat in the Gemara. It wasn't permissible to write it down. And then they saw it's going to be forgotten, so they allowed us to write it down to make sure that we preserve the whole Torah Shabbal Peh. So according to the Rambam, the Stammit's a mitzvah to write everything down in a sefer and to popularize the sefer. That's taka. A few people published the very fascinating svarim, and they printed all the masoras. So all of these masoras of the different birds will be preserved. So we're covered over here. The Chumash, Rabbi Genak mentioned earlier, the Chumash tells us regarding the simonim of behema and chaya, the way to determine whether any given animal is kosher or not, is malagera mafis parsa. That's what it says in the Chumash. Then the Torah has a pasuk in Chumash Dvarim in Parshas Re'eh, Shisua, may not be eaten. What is a Shisua? So the Gemara says the Shisua is an animal that's malagera and mafis parsa, and it's still asa b'achila. Why is it asa b'achila? Because it has shnei gab and shnei shedros. It has two backs, two spines. It has a split back. So the Gemara has a machlekes Rabbi Shmuel. What does that mean? So Rab is of the opinion that biologically, medically, such an animal cannot exist. It can't live. So it can't live, so there's nothing to discuss. So what do you need a pasuk that says you're not allowed to eat it if it can't exist? The Gemara says no, it must be talking about a ben pekua shisua. If you shech the vlad is the uber is nita b'shchita simo, so if the uber is an abnormal development and it has a shnei gab and a shnei shadra, so it's not included in the heter ben pekua. I remember when we were learning every day. So Rav Soloveitchik said to the Talmidim, "Don't laugh." He says he used to give ashkochas on a slaughterhouse in Boston, and he says He wasn't there every single day. He used to come to check from time to time. And when he was there, he saw on quite a few occasions Ben Pekua Shesua. He said it's not such an unusual occurrence, that there's such an abnormal development, Ben Pekua Shesua. So, and Shmuel disagrees, and the Gemara Shmuel says, no, such an animal can exist. If you would have a Ben Pekua Shesua, it would taka be Nita B'Shchita Sima. The pasuk goes on that min. There is such a min. And Shnei Gaben and Shnei Shadrois, and therefore it's also Bachil. So there's a question in the Rishonim how we're supposed to paskin. So in Shulchan Aruch we paskin Machlekes Rabbi Shmuel, and you don't have any hechrich in the Gemara one way or the other. So we follow the usual klal that whenever it's an issue of Issa V'Heta, like this is, so we follow the opinion of Rav. So the Torah Tamima, so we paskin la'alacha that a Ben Pekua Shesua is also because we assume there can't be such a min of a Shesua. It couldn't exist, couldn't survive. So the Torah Tamima on that pasuk quotes this whole discussion, Rabbi Shmuel and the Psak and Yeridea, and then he quotes Akasha, that they wrote up in the books on biology that there is such a wild animal in the African jungles, that's Malager, Mafis Parson, Shnei Gaben and Shnei Shedrois, and it does exist. So he quotes that the Rabbanim were Ma'or the Shaila. Maybe we should reverse the Psak and the Yeridea. Since we found out that such an animal does exist in the African jungles, so we see that Shmuel is right. So maybe we should pass on like Shmuel. Rather, the Ritva, he doesn't quote it. The Ritva quotes like that. The Ritva quotes, I think, the Ravid or some other Rishonim will say, I saw such an animal, so I know that Shmuel is right. So I hold the halachas like Shmuel. You can't apply the regular Kal Hilchas Karabi Yisuri, because one of the Rishonim writes, I saw the animal with my own two eyes, and it does exist in Shon, so Shmuel is correct. So the Torah Tamima quotes such a... So the Rishonim said that they saw it, Rav Soloveitchik also saw it, but it didn't survive. He saw Ben Pekua Shesua. He didn't see that there's such a min. That's the shaila whether such a min exists or not. So the Torah Tamima quotes from the biology books that such a min exists. So this is a fascinating kasha. So Rabbi Levinger from Switzerland, who published a very fascinating, a few svarim, I think, on kashrus, on animals, points out that just about 10 years ago, maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was an international conference of biologists or botanists or whatever the correct word is, and they came to Nachrim, not from Eden, Nachrim, international conference, that they came to realization that they misidentified that min in the African jungles, Sinish Malagera. It looked like it was Malagera. And then after further study and further investigation, it came to the realization that it's not Malagera. So we have no raya that Shmuel is right. We haven't yet discovered any such animal. So we remain with the Psak and the Shulchan Aruch. So this, I just mentioned this is an instance where for over 100 years it was assumed by the world's experts in the field that they identified this animal as a Malagera. Then they came to the realization as Sinishkin Malagera. So we can understand very well why the Chazon Ish, Rabbi Genak mentioned earlier that the Chazon Ish pointed out that for Yotzei Lita, for Litvakis, they always follow the Chayodim and the Chochmas Sodom. So he says for the Litvisha they should follow the Chochmas Sodom, who understood that there's a minig, not a din rabban, that there's a minig that you don't need a behemoth that's Malager Mafis Pars unless you have a clear-cut Masora that is mutter. So what do you need a Masora for? So we can understand why. If the world's biggest experts, all the biologists in the world, thought that this animal in the African jungle was Malagera, it happened that it had Shnei Gab and Shnei Shadros, so we were going to answer it anyway, thinking that we have succeeded in identifying the Shesua. But if over 100 years they made a mistake and they thought that was a Malagera, so it could be we can make a mistake on Malagera, could be we can make a mistake on Mafis Pars also, could be we'll think that something is Mafis Pars, and we'll come to the realization that it's not a Mafis Pars. So we can understand the concern for that's involved, the hashash that's involved in just saying we're going to follow the din and the chumash. It could be that we will misidentify. There is a Gemara in Bechoros Daf Zayin Omid Aleph, the Gemara quotes Rabbi Shua ben Levi, who claims a biological principle that the olam ein misaberes tameya mitahora or tahora mitameya, that you cannot have that a behemoth, two behemoths should mate together and have a vlad if one is kosher, one is not kosher. If one is a behemoth Torah, one is a behemoth mate, it's impossible physically that they should have a vlad. So the Chasam Sofer, quoted by the Pischei Tshuva and Yeridei Siman Pei Beis, Chasam Sofer in his Tshuvas, as well as Davnei Nezeh, quotes it from the Chasam Sofer, and he elaborates on it. So they assume that if you have a behemoth tahora, so you know that this cow is kosher, and then you see that this cow mates with a zebu, and you don't know whether the zebu is kosher or not kosher. You have no Mesora, you don't know anything. You don't know it's Malager, you don't know anything about it. But you know that it's Moilid. The two are Moilid together. So if the two are Moilid together, so then the Chassam Sofer says, based on this Gemara, that a Tamei is not Misaberes Minat Tahira, that since we eat the Tahira, so the Tamei, the questionable animal, that we don't know whether it's kosher or not, Behechrech, that has to be kosher as well. And the Mesora that you have, even if you hold like the Chachmas Sodom, that the minig is that you require Mesora on behemoths to determine whether it's behemoth Torah or not, but we have a Mesora on the kosher animal. And the fact that it mates together with the questionable animal, so the Mesora on the kosher animal carries over on the questionable animal. The question is, what about in birds? What's the story regarding birds? So I'd like to discuss that a little bit. If you look in the Chumash, I'll go back to the beginning. If you look in the Chumash, the Torah lists off 20 non-kosher birds. Rashi on Parsha Shmini says there are 24. How 24? The Chumash only has 20. Keep on counting and counting. So the Gemara has that kasha. The Gemara in Chumash another 4 birds. So you have the 20 listed explicitly in the Chumash plus another 4 that are Nisraba from the Liminayim. So there are 24 birds. So then the Gemara says